Okay, welcome everyone. Today's session is on grief post-COVID, and we have three wonderful speakers who will be speaking for 20 minutes apiece, and then we'll have a discussion period at the end for 30 minutes. And you're all welcome to ask your questions. There'll be a microphone set up, and we're taking questions online as well. In this symposium, you will hear from three leaders in the field of grief and loss about their experiences during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Reverend Cindy Casey, Dr. Sue Morris, and Dr. Bill Webster will provide insights for the ongoing support of caregivers, both professional and personal, as well as the vulnerable and the grieving in a world that is learning to live with COVID-19, and of course we hope its aftermath. I'll introduce each speaker now. The first one, Reverend Cindy Casey, will speak about individual and family experience. Cindy Casey is a minister with the United Church of Canada, and she led the COVID-19 response in the community of faith that she serves here in Canada. Our second speaker, Dr. Sue Morris, will address the ways in which a large academic medical center took their bereavement services on Zoom, so online, and the challenges that they faced. Dr. Morris works as a psychologist at the Dana-Farber Center in Boston. And our third speaker we'd like to welcome is Dr. Bill Webster. He will examine the impact of COVID on frontline healthcare workers and the possibility for renewal, resilience, and post-traumatic growth. Dr. Webster has many years of experience as a grief counselor. He is the director of the Center for the Grief Journey, and he is also the author of a recent book, Caregiving in Challenging Times. I welcome you all. Thank you for coming, and welcome our first speaker, Cindy Casey. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devin, for that wonderful introduction and for welcoming everybody here this morning. Just by way of making sure everyone has this information, I have no conflicts of interest, and so I wanted to let you know that I have nothing to disclose in that regard. So, good morning, and thank you for being here with us, being with Sue and Bill and I as we share our experiences during the height of the pandemic and the ramifications of COVID in our respective fields. My name is Reverend Cindy Casey, and as Devin said, I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada, currently serving a congregation in Ottawa. I also had the opportunity to do some of my training, which was actually the most significant part of my training, at the Jewish General Hospital here in Montreal in palliative care. And it was an honor to work with some of the most remarkable people I have ever had the opportunity to work alongside. And I share that for no other reason than to provide the context from which my remarks extend. So let's begin. Like everyone else, for families, for professionals, for everyone, COVID came on like a tidal wave. We could all see it coming on the horizon as it made its way from continent to continent. We watched it approach through the various news cycles and public health announcements, and in some way, it is as though we stood awestruck, somehow incapable to completely understand what was coming. School breaks were extended and the children cheered, and parents thought, oh well, that's okay. People thought, well, we can make arrangements for the next couple of weeks until this thing passes. So yes, we heard the information, but we had no idea what was coming. Its arrival, the sheer size and magnitude was beyond all imagination, and suddenly we were thrust right into it. We were unprepared, and there was no escaping. It happened, and it affected every walk of life, every profession, every lifestyle, every socioeconomic factor. Of course, as is always the case, that same socioeconomic factors that often render the defenseless most vulnerable did so again in this pandemic. No one was immune. Likewise, we know that when we really stop to think about where we were as a world pre-pandemic, even the most nostalgic among us cannot escape the reality that pre-COVID, we were living in divisive times. Politically, the schisms were growing wider. Professionally, those in the care professions, whether it be in healthcare, teaching professions, community support workers, or faith leaders, they were struggling with low wages, long hours, and decreasing staff. And while in those early days where the pandemic and the fear was palpable, the headlines were horrific, and those of us in caring professions and families and in relationships, we found ourselves working even harder and longer in unfamiliar territory. But we also found ourselves being thanked and appreciated. Suddenly, the visits to mom meant something more, and we missed not being able to make them. The picking up the children at school and chatting with neighbors and friends was no longer something we could easily do. So it wasn't only for the healthcare professionals, but it was extending to anyone who was living in the time. It affected all of us. And the differences between professional and unprofessional and lay workers and clergy and all of those went aside, because for that brief moment in those early days when you stood in line for an hour to get to the grocery store and slightly longer to get into the liquor store, we were all together. We were strong, we were committed, and we were all hands on deck, and we were certain we would be just fine. But it continued. And with no end in sight and with no relief, just like that, grief set in. And the grief that set in went beyond the deaths, and it extended into everything that was being lost. Every relationship, every moments with colleagues, every opportunity to walk down the street, to encounter one another, to just run over to the store and pick up that little something you forgot. As care professionals, we lost our support systems. We no longer gathered over lunch with a colleague to go over a particularly difficult scenario. We no longer received a handshake or a hug just to say thank you. We were no longer able to just put a hand on someone's shoulder to console them and have that human connection with those we serve most gently. We no longer found refuge in our extended families or gym memberships or recreational activities. You could no longer go out and just stroll through the favorite part of your city. All that was gone. But the work and the worry and the burden and the impact that all of that had on our families continued. Grief had set in, and as grief often does, it turned to anger. For me, one of the most difficult pieces was not in the more familiar of people dying, but instead how those left behind were left to grieve in isolation. No longer did the call go out to say that their loved one had died and that suddenly they would be surrounded by family and friends to console them. No longer were visitors received, visitors who hugged and laughed and cried and shared stories. For those of us serving these people, there was no longer a community that helped shoulder the burden of grief, of loss, and of pain. We were now doing it on our own. There were no formal celebrations of a person's life. You were no longer surrounded by others, so much so that usually in regular times, by the time you got to the part of being alone, you were just a little bit okay with that because there had been so many people around you. That never happened because we were no longer living in community. No longer possible were the rituals on which we had come to rely. Instead, all we had were our tears, our worries, and our uncertainty. And it wasn't just for the ones who lost loved ones. It was for each and every one of us in this room, all of our colleagues, and anyone in a position of caring for others. Dealing with the sick and dying, working with the grief-stricken in the moment, and walking with others on the path through bereavement has its own weight. And in grieving without communities, for families and for us, has been a tremendous loss. So whether it was the son who left his home in Ottawa to travel to New Brunswick, having to prove entry, that his need was great enough so he could get into a different province, because his father was dying. He had taken time from work, committed to staying in the 2-week isolation time. But before the isolation period was up, his father died. He had to stay in isolation. So even though his mother was a few kilometers away, he could not go and console her. Or the woman who, in the course of those first 18 months, lost a brother, a mother, and her husband. Not due to COVID, due to the other things that happen in life. But they could not grieve for 18 months until all three were buried together at the same time. Or then there are people who knew they were dying pre-COVID. They had planned, they had done all the things that they wanted to do, they had checked all the checklists, they had prepared their service, they had prepared their hymns, and then they died. But there was still no plan in place. There was still nothing that could yet be done to fulfill that person's wishes. That service took 2 years to come to fruition. These were great weights that came upon the families. The community shifted around them. It shifted from under their very feet. They couldn't rely on what they had always known to be true. You know, as someone who is a minister in the church, I'm very well aware that most people aren't there on a Sunday morning. There is church decline across faiths, across denominations, and right across the world. And we know that there are still rituals on which people rely. But the most important ritual that we rely on is community. And community is what we had lost. Now, the stories I've shared, and that list could go on for hours, and I'm sure each of you have a list that is equally as long as mine. But the one thing that ties my stories together is me. And the one thing that ties your stories together is you. And that is an awful lot of grief for any one of us to bear. And this is what has been part of the tidal wave. A tidal wave so unprecedented that the ramifications of it are so far long yet to be known. And so, of course, families grieved, and professionals grieved. And we did get creative, didn't we? We went online, we visited outdoors, we decorated our masks. There was no roadmap, but creativity abounded. I, for one, broadcast to an empty sanctuary for 2 years. There was no one sitting in a pew, just the cameraman. And there were people beyond that camera, of course. But what did that do for me? What does all the ways in which you reach out to other people do for you? Because we care for the families we serve, but we also have the families to which we belong. And so as we are moving back into community, and we are because we're here today, so we know things are happening. We know vaccines are abundant. Protocols are being evaluated. A new way of being together is emerging. And as the waters of the tidal wave begin to recede, left behind in the debris is, of course, those who have passed away, the loss of livelihood, the loss of community, but somehow the divisiveness and the discord has remained. And it remains for us in our work and the families and the people that we serve. Because now it's not, oh no, we can't get together for whatever holiday. It's instead, who's vaccinated, who isn't? Who's got a cough, who doesn't? Who has small children who we all know bring home everything in terms of a virus from school? And these are creating divisions. The disagreements to move forward and how we're going to do that are rampant. So the question is no longer, how can I possibly survive in isolation? But instead, how can we possibly come together as community? The fear lingers with good reason, and we as care providers and community leaders are walking a line between what can be done, which for some is not enough, what cannot be done, which for others is far too much, and the anger is palpable. It's seeping into our lives and into our families, and the pandemic has taken such a great toll on both. We have been grieving without community, grieving without touch and isolation, and in isolation. We have been caring for the dying and the grieving without support for so long. And so yes, we are tired. And yes, there is that familiar emotion of anger that is present. And yes, we do need to be looking at the systems in place that created such a shortage of care professionals way before the words COVID, pivot, and protocols became part of the common vernacular. But we have also accomplished much. We have walked with families in new and creative ways. We have made space to do things differently. We have learned technologies that otherwise we would have been kicked screaming and yelling into learning. And we have stopped and looked at how we do things and how we can better serve families. So there have been benefits. We have made things available for people who can really not comfortably leave their home. We're remembering them now in our considerations for events, for opportunities, for worship services, and for bereavement groups. We're doing that differently. We've learned how flexibility in the workplace can ease the burden, particularly of a single parent who a sick child meant a vacation day. No longer the case. We have realized that community is essential to our overall well-being, and the understanding that no man is an island is more relevant than it has ever been. And so while the struggle to get back into community is not an easy one, it is most definitely a struggle worth having. Community is essential. It is essential to us as care providers. It is essential to families for them to thrive. Isolation damages and hurts beyond anything that any virus can create. Community creates friendship, care, understanding. It enlightens us, it teaches us, and it changes us every single day. So we continue this battle, we continue this work, and we continue to remember that we need each other. We need the people we love, we need the people we care for, and we need to care for ourselves. So thank you for your time, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of this wonderful Congress. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Cindy. That was wonderful. I think I want to come to your church and listen to you. It's actually, I think, just to be able to sit and pause and listen to the impact of this, what you just said, is really important, and I don't think we probably do enough of that. So I'm Sue Morris. I'm a clinical psychologist and work at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. But I'm actually originally from Sydney, Australia, if you can't pick my accent. And I have had the privilege to work at Dana-Farber for about 13 years now and have worked in bereavement. I say all my life, but I technically mean all my career between Sydney and Boston, and have worked in expected death and unexpected death. So I'm going to kind of change tack a little bit here and talk about what we did as a large academic medical centre for the bereavement service that I run at Dana-Farber. So let me just move my slides along here. Just as a conflict of interest, I do have received book royalties for self-help books that I write, and I'm an advisory board member for a parents group in Brazil. So just as far as learning objectives go today, I'm really going to be talking about the challenges of providing virtual bereavement support and ways that we try to address these, and then to look at also at the benefits of virtual support, and also kind of going forward where we go from now. So I'm going to start with my conclusions up front. And following on from what Cindy said, the COVID-19 pandemic, as everybody knows, has affected all our lives, but it's highlighted, especially in the US, the lack of universal bereavement support and resources. Virtual visits, though, and bereavement groups, I would say, provide a cost-effective way of hospitals and institutions to increase access to bereavement support. And certainly from my own experience with planning and preparation, structured group programs can be readily adapted for virtual platforms. And I think going forward, even though we're still kind of in the pandemic, a hybrid model appears like it's likely to be the preferred format. I don't think we're ever going to go back to complete in-person kind of groups. So just kind of within the palliative care frame, we know bereavement is a standard of care, and bereavement care is a core element of high-quality end-of-life palliative care endorsed by the hospital and palliative care movement. And caring for bereaved family members is seen as an extension of the care of the patient. And we best conceptualise bereavement care as a preventive model of care. And as a psychologist, I'm always thinking about these two important goals. We want to facilitate a bereaved person's adaptation to the change that they're experiencing in their life brought upon by loss, but then really importantly to identify those we think who are likely to be at risk of a difficult bereavement outcome, so that we can intervene early and try with a kind of a prevention model to be able to help those people. I think, sadly though, bereavement care within palliative care has kind of lagged behind other areas of palliative care, and certainly now this pandemic has highlighted that, we just do not have enough bereavement support. And, as Cindy mentioned, we also don't have enough kind of clinicians providing kind of mental health support as well. So throughout my career early on, and I've been probably doing this work now for about 25 years, I would have focused initially on change. Change would have been the psychological kind of factor that I would have focused on a lot when I meet people. And still, of course, I'm focusing on how much does somebody's life change when somebody they love dies, because, everyone here has, I'm sure, experienced their own losses, and we know we grieve people we're significantly attached to. And then we think about how much does somebody's life change after somebody dies. But more recently, and certainly probably the last 10 years, I've started to focus more on isolation, to think about how isolating the death of a loved one is for bereaved family members. And I mean isolating kind of obviously can be physical, but psychologically, even if you've got other people around you, grief is a very lonely and isolating experience that nobody else can do for you. You have to do it yourself. So this isolation is, something that we talk a lot about in kind of bereavement support. Just to give you a little bit of background about Dana-Farber's bereavement service, which I am very proud of, I can say. So Dana-Farber is a large academic medical centre in Boston, and it's a teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School. It's an outpatient facility, so patients come there to see their oncologists and nurses and have their infusions, but they go inpatient into a adjoining hospital. The bereavement service was established in 2010 when I came from Sydney, and we have about 2,800 deaths a year on the adult service. We also have a paediatric service, and we work in collaboration there with Boston Children's Hospital. So Dr. Susan Block was the chair of our department and employed me, and together we developed an education, guidance and support model for the Institute, which didn't previously have a standardised bereavement service. We decided, just because of the volume and also knowing that the majority of bereaved people will do okay on their own, we think about 10% of bereaved people will probably need professional intervention. We established like an education, guidance and support model. We provide short-term individual support, group support and referral information, all free of charge. I'm trained in cognitive behaviour therapy, so the way I've developed the program is very CBT based, and for people who know that, it's kind of loosely based around cognitive behaviour therapy principles, and I offer seminars, groups, drop-in groups, a range of things. And because of the number of bereaved families we have, I can offer certain groups that are based on the type of loss. So we would have a lot of, the main group would be spouse group of people who are probably in their 60s and 70s. Then we have a young adult program at Dana-Farber. We care for a lot of young adult patients. So I have young adult partner groups, people who are in their 30s or 40s who have lost a partner. And then the other group are parents of young adult children. So their young adult children have died in their 20s or 30s, and we support their parents. And then another common one is adults who have lost their parents. And, prior to the pandemic, people had to be able to drive back into Boston to come to these groups. And, many family members don't live in Boston. So it was kind of a select group of people. So when we kind of just pause for a minute to think of the impact of the pandemic on the bereaved, and, Cindy obviously laid it out very nicely for us as well as bereaved family members, it is this increased isolation that I believe has kind of generated this out of sight, out of mind kind of assumption. We don't see people in the same way, so therefore we're not necessarily thinking, gee, I'll just go and call and see how my friend's doing who's just lost their dad, or I'll drop some food in. And everyone was also dealing with their own stresses. So there was this very much out of sight, out of mind, which I think has kind of still is persistent. There was less available emotional support because people weren't seeing each other. There's no community or less community. There was less practical support due to the stay-at-home policies. So for people who were maybe elderly, whose children weren't going to visit them to help them do the practical parts of their bereavement, they would only visit maybe through the window. Increased stress about completing administrative tasks, that again still persists now because people are by and large working remotely or hybrid. So when people say, I need to go to the bank, I need to go to the lawyer, I've got to go to Social Security, whatever that is, I tell them it always takes now 3 times as long. And I think that's even an underestimate. It's actually much more stressful, we all know that. And that is a huge burden for bereaved people. The lingering impact of the visitor policy, I don't think we'll know that for some time, but a lot of bereaved people feel very guilty because they weren't able to be with their loved one in the way they wanted to be, and they can also be very angry at the hospital and the clinicians because of the visitor policy. And, I think the ramifications will feel that, going forward. And then the one that I'm really noticing now, given that everybody's starting to get back a little bit into their life, as Cindy said, we're all here, it's this prolonged re-entry to normal activities and routines. And that's really important for grieving people early on to get back into their lives, and they've not been able to do it. It's been suspended. And so now I'm starting to see people who maybe their loved one died more than a year ago. So the natural assumption by other people around them is that, gee, you've passed the first anniversary, you should be kind of over it by now. Whereas now people are starting to re-enter life, and they've been just hit with so many more kind of triggers and seeing people they haven't already seen. And so this prolonged re-entry is really, I think, going to cause it causes difficulty because most other people think they should be grief is linear and they should be back to normal, whereas we know grief follows much more a wave-like pattern. So what we did, we went on Zoom. I now say I wish I had had Zoom shares because, I don't think I'd ever used Zoom, maybe once or twice before the pandemic. But by the end of March 2020, when obviously everything went downhill, we moved all bereavement groups and individual visits online. We did it pretty quickly. It was fairly easy because I'd already known people in person, and it was pretty easy to shift them online. From March 30th, now I put March 30th there because it was a Monday. I don't want you to think I don't know how many days are in March. I know there's 31. But from March 30, which was a Monday, to I looked at 2 years, I went to March 31st this year, we've offered 347 virtual group sessions with over 2,400 participants. Some of them can be the same participants because people attend 6 to 8 session groups. But it's a lot of people, it's a lot of Zoom. If you'd asked me 3 years ago that I would spend a lot of time in my own home office looking at a screen, hoping I don't get vertigo, I would never have thought that this would have been the case. And, it's worked very well, and I'll talk about that, but short-term individual visits for me now, as well as groups, still remain online. And people are wanting to get back in person, but it's not possible at the hospital. So some groups are starting to say they'll meet socially on their own afterwards. So just to kind of talk a little bit about the challenges, and I'm assuming not everyone here is running virtual bereavement groups, but I think they're kind of here to stay. And if you're in your organisations, it can be a way of helping. We need to promote how we're going to continue to offer bereavement support for people who have been impacted, not only from COVID deaths, but who have died through this time. I think, determining the fit for an online group can be a little challenging. I screen everybody who wants to come to one of the bereavement groups, so I meet them individually for about 50 minutes. That helps with the relationship. We've been talking a lot about through this conference about the importance of being in relationship with other people. I get to kind of hear their story, they get to kind of know me a little bit. They're kind of dipping their toe in the water to see because, let's face it, nobody wants to attend a bereavement support group. I mean, it's just people wish they weren't going to a bereavement support group. But it does help them gradually kind of think that they could try this. For me personally, there's a lot more preparation up front that happens. But, I feel like I'm in a bit of a rhythm now because it's become, it's 2.5 years of practice. But certainly organisation is key. There's a lot of emailing, there's a lot of Zoom balls up in the air, you're emailing people. We send out a workbook for people for the group. That's kind of the course outline and the group. You know, normally I would have just handed that out in the first session, so we have to think, we've got to mail those out, I've got to get to the hospital to mail them out, so there's a lot of these layers. I usually would have a whiteboard in my group room, so now some of those things have to be on a PowerPoint slide to show people. And the one thing that I think has worked, even though it's, you know, does take a lot of energy, is that in the third session of all my groups, people share photos of their loved ones. And normally they would have brought them in a frame, you know, a couple of photos each. Now they have to email them to me ahead of time so I can get them in a PowerPoint presentation. But for me, that means I get to know their loved one a little bit differently than I would if I was seeing them for the first time. And that I've actually very much kind of enjoyed. Zoom etiquette, you know, I think we all know what Zoom etiquette's like, and for people who are, ourselves, if we're doing Zoom and we can tell someone's multitasking while you're doing a presentation, that can be a little bit disconcerting. But I send out consent guidelines ahead of time with guidelines about Zoom etiquette and review them in the session. I ask participants to behave as if they were in a real room, which means no private chats or multitasking. I'm not sure they all do that. But I have decided to pick my battles. This is a lot of work, so I pick my battles. It sounds like I'm thinking about how I used to pick my battles with my kids, but I've picked my battles and decided that I'm not going to be the Zoom police, but I will obviously pick up on anything to do with confidentiality or privacy. And, you know, and sometimes, you know, there's usually one person who doesn't always behave, but, you know, you have to then, as I say, pick your battles. Otherwise, I think I would be, you know, constantly stressed about the whole thing. And then group cohesion. Groups actually have gelled pretty well. I'm going to do some surveys about this to see what people think. People are ambivalent, but usually by the second session, people are saying, I'm looking forward to coming back, because I think they're so isolated otherwise. And, you know, I always am very aware of expectations. I try to lay expectations out clearly, and there's always a group exercise. I chose not to use breakout groups, which I know we do a lot in our teaching, but most people want to hear what other people have to say, and they don't want to miss out on what someone else says. And there's usually about 8 or 9 people in a group, so it's manageable. There can be technological issues. You know, obviously, we have to make sure people can use the technology. Sometimes if you have 2 facilitators, that can help, but that's not usually easy to do. If I have a student following me, they may help, help with the kind of logistics. But then I think just to kind of, as I wrap this up, the thing that has kind of struck me and not struck me is that participants don't want the groups to end. You know, we do 8 sessions, and then I normally would say, we would continue in a drop-in group, you know, with other groups. They could continue to pop back in. And when this was in person, what would naturally happen is people would do their groups, maybe come to some drop-in groups, and then eventually think, I'm doing okay, I've got support in my community, and they would then naturally wean off coming back to the hospital. Whereas now I'm finding nobody wants to leave. So I cannot tell you how I'm scheduled. And I've also, you know, thinking about caring for myself, I run groups all evenings now, which I would never have done in the hospital because I would have a long commute. So I'm going to have to start practicing what I preach because self-care is my other area of interest. But people don't want it to end, and I think it speaks to the isolation. It also speaks to the access. And, you know, people Zoom in from other states. So it's people can just get there. But now I'm hoping that they'll start to kind of leave and meet in person in their own community if they want to keep doing that. And for me personally, though, I was thinking about what Cindy was saying. I'm a very social person. I get, I'd always worked in, palliative care and bereavement, so that people often say, well, how do you do that work? And how I do that work is because I love the community of my colleagues. And at the moment, I don't have very good access to them because I'm at home most of the time. doing in my own office at home, because we have open plan offices at work, which, were pre-existed before the pandemic, obviously. And I feel kind of isolated as well, and I'm aware that this is something we have to think about if we're going to continue into our third year of how is this sustainable. And that's probably a whole talk for another day. But so future directions for bereavement online support groups. I think hybrid models have great potential. I think including opportunities to meet in person at some point is helpful. I did meet a group recently. They invited me to meet them, and I met them, and it was just lovely. And I think the question is, everybody says, oh, I didn't think you'd be so tall. And, people don't know how tall people are, but, you kind of get to know people. And it was just lovely to meet people, because I think it gets back to that relationship and being present. Although I do think you can be present on Zoom, you've just got to work out how you kind of do that. And we did a preliminary survey of 20 bereaved parents, of the parents who had attended the young adult group, and a couple of groups over the last 2 years. And they said, as you can see there, 30% wanted the virtual groups, and 25% wanted in-person, and then 45% wanted a hybrid model. And I can tell that's been driven that a lot of them didn't live in Massachusetts. They lived in neighbouring states, so they wouldn't have been able to drive to the group. So they got what they needed online, and plus a lot of them were working. So just logistically, it made sense. So I do think, as I'm going to revamp this program next year to see what we can do going forward, I really think Zoom kind of is here to stay. Or Zoom, or whatever platform you use, virtual platforms. So conclusions are then that while there can be challenges, and especially with engagement and managing logistics, the online format has certainly increased accessibility, especially because of geographical barriers. Certainly preparation, setting expectations, choosing to pick your battles is definitely important. And as I said, it's here to stay, and and I think it's like Cindy was saying, we've gotten creative. I think we need to be becoming a little bit more creative to work out how to continue to have opportunities to be able to kind of meet in person as well. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Nope, not good enough. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Bill Webster, and I feel very honored in many ways. First of all, to have had the privilege of getting to know these two ladies and working together with them. It has been absolutely superb. I hope we've made a great team, and what we're trying to do will coordinate. I also want to thank Devon and all the people who have organized this conference. I've never, in my 35 years of speaking at conferences, never been at such an organized conference. It's been absolutely fabulous. I do have to declare a conflict of interest. I am a consultant with Arbor Memorial. Arbor Memorial is a funeral organization in Canada, and I'm a consultant with them, and they use my grief support programs right across the country. And I think it's a great model, because the funeral home doesn't do it. They take it to their community, and hospices and hospitals and all others can come together. We train facilitators. I've produced 12 30-minute videos with a facilitator's manual, and this is starting to sound like an advertisement here, but I don't intend it that way. But anyhow, I'm very pleased to be there. I'm going to be around at the booth if you want to come and chat a little bit afterwards. So my part in this symposium is to talk a little bit about frontline responses. And I think I was sitting there in amazement, because I think what we've done together is just going to coordinate. But I want to think about many of you who've actually been on the front line. And it hasn't always been good news. I'd like to introduce you to a hero of mine. Here he is. No, actually, it's not the police officer, although the police officer may very well be a hero. It's that little guy by the table. His name is Ciro Ortiz. He's 11 years old. And from an early age, he was bullied. Bullied quite badly. He suffered in silence for a number of years. And then he finally told someone. And out of that difficult experience, he set up this little table in New York City to give emotional advice, $2. His mom and dad are with him there all the time, of course. But out of the compassion that he felt for others who might be going through similar stresses, he turned it around to offer some support and some help. It's quite a well-known story. He actually makes about $50 on a Saturday, and he uses every penny of that money to donate, to give snacks to other kids who've been bullied and other kids who perhaps can't afford the kinds of snacks. These are the kind of heroes that we identify with. And many of you are heroes also. That word has been used quite frequently in the last 2 years. We're heroes. But I want to challenge you in a little more personal way. Because where do we as caregivers begin to talk about loss? Now, we've heard some wonderful models. I have such utmost respect for the models that have been illustrated by Cindy and by Sue. But it's not always a good news story. I've spoken to a number of funeral directors who, dealing with certain issues around bereavement and so on. I said, well, you're dealing with this all the time. You should be used to it. How come you're grieving? I do a training program with the Peel Regional Police, and I've talked to some of the volunteers, and again, that same thing comes back. Well, you're professionals. I've spoken to many nurses and doctors who've had the same thing. I experienced it myself. I lost my son tragically 4 years ago in an accident where he suffered a severe brain injury and died three weeks after. And I remember at his funeral, someone came up to me. I've been a grief counselor for 35 years. There are some people who think I'm something of an expert. You know my definition of an expert? An expert is someone who's more than 100 miles away from home. So I'm so glad to be in Montreal. But someone came up to me at his funeral, and they meant well. They really meant well, but they said to me, "Oh, Bill, you're our grief counselor. I hope you don't fall apart over this, because then what hope is there for us?" And I carried that for over a year. And I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't talk about it. I held it inside. And I don't need to explain the damage that one can do to one's own persona dealing with it or not dealing with it in that way. But I think many of us as professionals have this idea that as professionals, we should be able to handle this, and we leave our humanity aside in that search. So I believe that what we need are courageous conversations. And I'm hoping I can help to facilitate some of that in my presentation today. You see, there's really two different kinds of courage. There's the courage to act and the courage to feel. Many times in a crisis, you hear of people dashing in, rushing in, whether it's in the armed forces, whether it's a police officer. We rush in and we do what we need to do. Dangerous situations where split-second decisions have to be made. We do something heroic without even thinking. In spite of the dangers, we get on with it. And yet it's later, maybe a little ways down the road, that we stop and think about, my goodness, what have we gone through? The risks that we took, and they have an emotional reaction to what they've seen and what they've been through. People's responses are very different, of course. But the problem is that after being so strong and acting with courage and bravery in the situation, later on, we can feel like we're falling apart in what's sometimes termed as a post-traumatic stress reaction. So there's this danger. And I think part of the difficulty with some people is that a year down the road, or a couple of years down the road, we don't want to open Pandora's box because we're afraid we won't be able to get it all back in again. Pandora's box, of course, comes from Greek mythology, when Zeus gave Pandora the gift of a box and told not to open it, but when it was opened, out came pestilence and all kinds of things. But how many of you remember the one thing that was left after Pandora's box was opened? Hope. Thank you. Hope. And you say, well, what is hope? Hope, in my definition, is the expectation that good is yet to come. And I think when we can impart that to others, that's the thing. The courage to act and the courage to feel. Because you see, part of the difficulty is that we often don't talk about it. I think it's very important to remind ourselves what Mr. Rogers said. Mr. Rogers said, anything that is mentionable is manageable. And we don't often talk about loss. A loss, what's a loss? A loss is when you are deprived of something or someone that was of value to you. And so I think it's very important that we talk about, think about, feel what we've been going through. Because many of us have actually been struggling with stress. The definition of stress is the wear and tear of responding to life's pressures, demands, challenges, and changes. It happens to all of us. I wouldn't be able to stand here if I weren't under some stress. Stress isn't a bad thing. It happens. But I think the problem often is that we struggle with cumulative stress. You see, sometimes people think of stress in this way. Well, there's this, and then I have that, and then there's something else, but actually I don't think that's a good image. It's this, and this, and this, and this, and finally there's the straw that breaks the camel's back. How many times have you and I or other people been under stress, and you say, my goodness, they've been through so much. How come that was the breaking point? It was because the straw that breaks the camel's back. So, cumulative stress is the process of stress build-up over time and ongoing demanding or traumatic situations. And goodness knows, all kinds of caregivers have experienced just this very thing over the past few years. I think it's important to know the danger signals. And I've just identified 3. When my colleague said I had 20 minutes, I said, you must be kidding. But here we are, and we'll make that work. But here are just 3 obvious signals of cumulative stress. Number 1, emotional and physical exhaustion. Well, people have been working long hours and going the extra mile, so they're physically exhausted, but they're also emotionally exhausted. You know what I've discovered? Trust me, it takes a Scotsman a journey of 1,000,000 miles to say this: the body is smarter than the mind. Our body sometimes tells us something. We say, no, I'm doing fine, I'm handling this, I'm coping, and the body goes, oh yeah, okay. The other is cynicism, depersonalization. Oh no, what do they want now? How come there's so many demands? And we become cynical of the value of what we're doing. Inefficiency, a reduced sense of accomplishment. We're doing more, and yet we seem to be accomplishing less. It's also known as compassion fatigue. And again, we'll define that. Compassion fatigue is essentially about caring so much that it begins to hurt. And that's a negative aspect of working as helpers. It manifests itself in symptoms such as a decrease in energy, exhaustion, frustration, anger, dread of going to work. You know, the great resignation that we're seeing in some areas of the medical profession and other professions. Feelings of failure, negativity about one's profession or even about one's life. Burnout is only one element of the negative effects of compassion fatigue. It's known, of course, in circles, such the ones we walk, it's all, you have to have initials. So I'm going to talk to you about VT, which is vicarious traumatization. And the definition of that, I suspect every one of us will be able to identify with this. Vicarious traumatization is the cumulative and transformative impact on the caregiver's experience as a result of empathizing with or being present to survivors of difficult and sometimes traumatic life events. All of us, ladies and gentlemen, have been involved in the latter part of that. But it's the cumulative and transformative impact. We are changed. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. But it's a very, very real thing that we need to understand. And so the prolonged and recurring effects of COVID trauma. What have we been through? Well, I can only go briefly through this. Some of the stressors that we've experienced. Well, first of all, our own exposure to the virus. The grief of losing patients, colleagues, or family. The stress of triage decisions. And it's a very powerful stress. Allocating limited resources. Limited access to PPE, especially in the early days. Separation from family and friends. Mental and physical exhaustion. Going to work every day and coming to the realization, this job could be the death of me. Our own mortality. And confronting our inability to change what has happened. All of these factors added to the stress. So I'd like to invite you to take 30 seconds just to reflect for yourself. What are some of the stresses you have experienced over the past 2 years or so of the pandemic? And to whom have you talked about these stresses? Take a moment. Think about it. Consider it. And so what are some of the possible outcomes of that? Well, of course, PTSD. And some of the symptoms of PTSD that might apply here include reliving the trauma, which tends to deepen the trauma, of course, as we know. Avoidance of places, people, and activities that remind us of the trauma. Negative thoughts and emotions. Increased arousal, hypersensitivity, difficulty sleeping or concentrating, and being hypervigilant, adrenaline, always flowing, and easily angered or irritated. That's always the first sign that we're really struggling with what is going on. When our coping mechanisms are not cooperating. Another possible outcome, another more recent identification of GAD, generalized anxiety disorder. And really what we say about that is simply this: if this can happen, what else can happen? And the feelings of vulnerability that people might have that leads to GAD. So GAD is the existence of excessive worry or apprehensive expectation about an event or activity that is difficult to control. We've all been through it, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we're here. But this is something that we need to be aware of and to say, yeah, that's it. Because I think it's very important to identify that. So again, just take a few seconds. Can you identify what personal signs, symptoms, and signals that indicate to you that you are under stress? Just think of a few, just for a few seconds. So I think there are really two essential elements in responding to stress and GAD. I'm under stress because I'm running out of time, but hopefully we can pick up a couple of minutes if they don't cut me off. But I'm sure we'll cope with it. Two essential elements. Number one, the need for good self-care. Now these are obvious, except do we practice them? The elements of self-care, I think there are three. The first is education, understanding. I think all of this begins with understanding. Once I understood what I was doing after my son died, that was when I was able to move to the next level, which was expression, talking to someone about it, expressing my feelings. Remember, Mr. Rogers, anything that is mentionable is manageable. And I think that these two then lead to the third element, which is empowerment. I always believe that the reason that people are angry and guilty and blaming and so on, it's all rooted in a feeling of powerlessness. And it's enabling people to empower themselves, to take control over what they can take control over and let go of the rest, which is difficult, that really enables us. So some practical signs. Again, we'll go very quickly through. Number one, recognize the risk. If you're a caregiver, we're at risk because we're always giving. We are care givers. And as someone said, you can't keep giving people a part of yourself without eventually being empty-headed. I thought that would get a bigger laugh, but that's okay. Identify your unique signs of stress. I hope we've done that. Alleviate the stresses that you can. Create periods of rest and renewal. That's more than, now take your 2 weeks off or something. It's every single day. What do you do for yourself? So this summer, every day I've gone and whacked a bucket of golf balls. That's my thing. What's your thing? Okay? To just say, this is a time for me. Practice self-compassion. Be gentle with yourself about not being perfect. Listen to your inner voice. Oops, sorry. There we are. Let's go back. Understand your motivations for what you do. Practice setting limits. Cultivate a personal support system. Be you in both work and in play. Develop healthy lifestyle patterns and seek help if you need it. Mark Twain once famously said, "My most significant learnings have come after I thought I knew it all." And boy, did I learn that a couple of years ago. I've been doing grief counseling for 35 years. I've helped thousands of people. And when it hit me, it was different. The second thing is simply the need for the transformation of negative beliefs about ourselves, about our work, about the things that we do. I wish I could talk a little more about this. G.K. Chesterton once made this famous statement: "The chief object of education is not to learn things, but to unlearn things." And I wish I had time to illustrate that, the things I've had to unlearn in my life that came from my childhood. So take one last little moment to reflect. What is causing you added or excess stress in your life? What are some of the things you feel you would like to change? That's the feeling, but there's a final point. What do you want to do about it? So, ladies and gentlemen, one final statement. No one can persuade us to change. Each of us guards a gate of change that can only be opened from the inside. We cannot open the gate of another, only our own. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all three speakers. That was wonderful, all of you. We're opening up to questions, and we have at least 20 minutes, and we're very interested to hear from all of you. There's a microphone set up. Please ask your questions. In the meantime, while you're thinking about your question, I will ask the first question that came online. And this is directed to Cindy and everyone. What can we do or say to ourselves and to others to come back together as community when fear, anger, and division seems to be growing in the world around us and within us?
Okay, so is this microphone working okay? Bring it closer? Okay. How's that? Okay. So essentially, the one thing we can do in regards to developing and recreating community, particularly when people are afraid, is to take baby steps and to not demonize one another. We have to understand that there are people who are ready to move forward at a much faster pace than others are comfortable with. And we need to know why people are uncomfortable. And largely it is because they have a very good reason. It could be their own health, mental health, or physical health. And we need to respect one another in that. But we also need to continue to create opportunities. If we waited till everyone was 100% comfortable, we would not be here. We would not have this time together. We would not go out and have a cup of coffee together. But we have to respect those for whom that is simply not possible. And when we do that, and when we create these online opportunities, when we create space, when we understand where people may sit in a different spot because they're more comfortable in that regard, we honor that, we respect that. And we just keep talking. And we ask people, what can I do to help? What do you need? As opposed to assuming we have all the answers, because we don't. None of us does. So I hope that is helpful.
I think it is. Thank you very much, Cindy. I always work from a premise that there is a reason for every reaction. So I believe the important question is not the how-to as much as the why. The why has to come first. And I often ask, well, why are people afraid? Why are people angry? And we can understand some of the things, but I think again, a lot of it is related to the feelings of helplessness and powerlessness that they've experienced. And so I think you're absolutely right, that everyone's going to take this at their own pace. I think it's been wonderful. Some people here are wearing masks, some people are not wearing masks, and so on. And we're getting along and we're doing our own thing. And I think that when we can recognize and realize that we're all working at a different pace, but every behavior has a reason. I mean, and if you try to understand, what's the reason behind this reaction? You know, I mean, as one example, why are some children rebellious and disobedient, all that kind of stuff? Children would rather be punished than be ignored. And I think very often that's sometimes a very good way to even look at ourselves and our own behaviors. So there's a reason for every reaction. I always try to find out what that is.
Sue, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I'll pass.
Okay.
Next question.
Devin, were there other questions? Or, I, by the way, cannot see any
Yeah,
of you.
that's really
So you could all be doing some kind of, strange dance. You could be yawning and stretching, and I have no idea.
I suppose I'll just add, just thinking about it The thing that I think the divisiveness is hard, especially the role social media plays, and I think we can all, people posting things on their own page about, being vaccinated or not, some of that divide, and that's really hard, and I think we have to work out how we're going to, we were talking about healing, how are we going to heal some of those kind of broken relationships, especially within families where people may have, it's easy to write something and then, once it's out, without those kind of ramifications. So I think we have to focus on kind of repairing some relationships as well.
It's so true.
I think part
We'll
of
have somebody here at the
I beg
mic.
your pardon. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity and for the panelists. I'm a frontline chaplain. My name is Costa Theophanos. The question is for all of you. I'm frontline in long-term care and also palliative. So in terms of bereavement, what we've seen with COVID is that the dynamic of bereavement itself has changed, because we lose people and bury them, at least with the initial surges, months later. There were lack of resources in the community. There's also a sense in which our institutions themselves have failed us previously, where they were vehicles of meaning. So my question comes from families I have accompanied and people I have buried. What would you say
Thank
to
you.
comfort?
Why don't you go first, since you spoke last?
Sorry, what was your last, what did you do?
So my question is, what would you say to such people who experience what's becoming known in the chaplaincy literature and in neuroscience as moral injury? How would you explain this? How would you comfort them? Thank you.
Oh, me? Okay. It really, I mean, your question was very multifaceted. So it does mean that we are tending to the actual person in front of us. When we talk about, when you mentioned about institutions and the failing people, or the fact that, funerals, burials were taking place months later, that isn't actually completely new, right? We have long moved from a society that did, somebody died 3 days, there was a wake, there was visitation, there was a funeral. We have moved away from that. We have said, wait a minute, so-and-so's on vacation. Oh, I have a busy thing I have to do for work. And we were scheduling things around that as a society before COVID hit. This has more solidified that and taken that out of the shadows. So those things were prevalent previously. From a moral perspective, our responsibility is not to judge. Our responsibility is to listen and to offer. These are people's individual personal choices. I was speaking with some of Bill's colleagues last night at dinner, and they, and in terms of providing funeral arrangements and services, and they said, we are in the business of saying yes. And that is the most refreshing thing to hear, to be in the business of saying yes. How can I help? What can I do? That is our moral obligation, not to impart our ideas of what we think is the right way to do something onto somebody else. That would be, I hope that's helpful, Costas.
I think it is very helpful, and you've picked up some very important points. I believe that one of the many things that was lost was the loss of ritual. Now, what is a ritual? A ritual is not necessarily religious or humanist or secular. A ritual, by its simplest definition, a ritual is something you do when you don't know what to do. And I think there are some people who have been very creative in creating new rituals around this. There were a lot of people at the very beginning who, when they were only allowed to have 10 people at a funeral, or they weren't even allowed to have a funeral, who said, well, later on down the road, we'll do something. We'll have a celebration of life. And I think that from the colleagues that I've spoken to, generally speaking, that hasn't happened. And so in my opinion, as a grief counsellor, that lack of ritual means that something's unfinished. There's lack of closure. And so I wrote a pamphlet that was entitled, "The Importance of a Meaningful Goodbye." And I think that giving people the opportunity, and you're absolutely right, it has to be their agenda. It's not my agenda or the clergy's agenda or anybody's agenda. It's their agenda to say what would be meaningful for you in your situation that would be respectful in celebrating a person's life. So I think this is a great opportunity for those of us who are involved in supporting grieving people to come up with new rituals, new ways of expressing what again, not just to be personal, but I feel very flattered that for 4 years now, throughout COVID, Steve's friends have all organized a golf tournament in his memory. They're still doing it, and we had 60 people who showed up 4 years later. You see, so as you should be sort of just, well, no, let's get over it and move on. Not a chance. So again, I think it's that creativity that we need.
Yeah. And I can just add about, for the colleagues, for people who are, especially when the hospitals, there were a lot of deaths, a lot of fasts, kind of not much time in between. We've been doing it for years at Dana-Farber for the inpatient palliative care, but we have remembrance every Tuesday morning. And I was telling these two actually, only 30 minutes, which doesn't sound like a long time, but every Tuesday we remember the patients who died the last week and we reflect on them. Someone has it's like a ritual, like you're saying, Bill. Someone might read a poem, sing, they may play a song, but then we read the list. And we do it on Zoom now, which at first we were like pushing a little bit back on that, but we couldn't be all in the same room together. And that's actually also increased access. We have people on their days off Zooming in who have seen their patients die and, constantly die. And, I say it's the highlight of the week, and it definitely gets back to that sense of community, but creating a space that is protected time for our colleagues. So that is something that comes to my mind.
Thank you for your answers. I think it's wonderful that you have those resources. I think, though, working for the public system, during periods where there were shutdowns, families couldn't see their loved ones, funerals that couldn't be done because funeral homes didn't have the resources, small towns where I live, and also where I serve in long-term care, the precarious situation is to comfort people in ways where the resources don't exist, the most vulnerable. So certainly to attend, we reflect back choices where sometimes choices are not readily available. So again, I think the crisis that this has exposed is much larger, and we're just beginning to do this reflection and research into what's called moral injury, which is closely related to PTSD with veterans. But again, it's new work, and we'll see what it yields. However, the question remains, how do we articulate our suffering? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think that illustrates really that, I think sometimes we think, well, we're through it, it's over, it's all good news stuff. We have a lot of challenges still ahead.
Absolutely. Devin, was there something else?
Can't say.
This scares me more than anything.
Getting questions from all sides. Here we are. What can we do or say to ourselves and to others to come back together? No, that's not. We asked that question before, so hold on. Sorry, we have another question, but it's not there. Just a sec.
Voilà.
Merci. Here we are. I'm sorry. Are you able to advise us on how we can support our teammates to recognize and manage compassion fatigue that they are experiencing which has a negative effect on the well-being of other members of the team?
Well, I mean, I'm a toolbox kind of person, so I think we need skills and tools and creating space, and we know debriefing is one of the best strategies to help people, and it can be informal debriefing, but I think when people are starting to feel like they're just going, or they're feeling whatever they're feeling about the work they're doing, no one should have to worry alone. We need to find somebody else who understands, who gets it, who has a similar experience to being able to kind of talk, and then to help people, guide them to get help, because it is a lot that, I think just even listening to Cindy today, I was, as I said at the beginning of my talk, reflecting on just sitting here for 20 minutes listening to this. What everyone has gone through is, we live in this fast world, we think we can just fix things. Well, this is something that, we can't fix, and we will have to pay a lot of attention. But I would say no one should have to worry alone, and to use debriefing, whether it's informally or formally, to help go through some of the things that people witness.
Dr. Earl Grolman was one of the pioneers of grief support and very well known in many, many areas, and he died last year. And in reading his biography and writing a tribute to him, which I was asked to do, Dr. Grolman was one of the first people in New York City after 9/11. And he was there right at ground zero. And what he said to people was this: I'm here, and when you're ready to talk, I will listen. Which I thought was really a stroke of genius. He spoke to many people, and when he left, 600 people gathered to thank him for coming. And I think it was just that humble, simple, I'm here for you, that sort of opened people to say, yeah, here's someone I can relate to. So I hope that adds to the mix.
And I think one other thing that you can do, is particularly in the staff team, is to always make space for the conversation to occur. We shouldn't be creating situations where, because we can all make comments, right? We can say, oh my goodness, I'm so tired because I've been running around like crazy, and gee, I wish we had more staff. Well, in saying that, I'm sending a message that may be true, but you're also sending a message that you can't tell me that you're also thinking that you might need to take some time away, because now I'm going to create an additional burden for you. So the management teams have to create space for those conversations to occur, and they have to make them a positive piece of what we do, as opposed to, we treat physical illness really well. We still struggle with mental health, and we still, nobody has a problem saying, oh my God, I've thrown it at my back, I need to be off for a week. We all understand, we all sympathize, we all move forward. But what about, I just can't come in? What about, I need to go to speak to somebody, and I'm seeing them once a week at this time? And so we need to create space in our systems that allow this. COVID has made us more aware of it, but this has been an issue since the beginning of time. This has been a long-standing issue. I think we're getting close to the end of our time.
Are there any more questions out there, online or in the room? We have one.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Thanks. I'll keep it brief. I really appreciated the knowledge that all of you brought today. I really appreciated the talk. My name is Nicole Wickjord. I work for First Nations Health Authority of British Columbia. And I love hearing about the way we often talk things out. It's a very Western way. And I wonder if any of you are commenting on how you use art or other creative ways. I know this morning we heard about physicians who are writing books. You talked about poetry and other creative ways that people come together to heal. Thanks.
I think that's a great question. I'm not an artist, but I'd love to have art as part of kind of grief support. The one thing that I have been involved in that happened just prior to the pandemic's going down, and then we kind of did it after, throughout, was working with a nurse scientist who also happens to be a musician. And so she was working with, this was with staff, nurses who'd been, doing the work they do at end of life. And they would pair up with a songwriter and they would tell their story, and then the songwriter would put it to music, and then we would come back together, and then the songwriter would play their song, and it was playing their story. It was so powerful. It was a group process over about 4 or 5 weeks. And my hope had been that I would be able to do something like that with bereaved parents of these young adult children, but we haven't kind of got there yet. So I think music, journaling, writing, art, all wonderful ways to express people's pain and suffering.
And I don't do that sort of level of work, so it's not something I can speak to, but I can say that I had a child who greatly benefited from that. And I think I'm really glad for the question, because I think we have to remember that not all tools require a conversation. And for those of us for whom speaking comes naturally, we make that our default position. And it is good to be reminded that there are many other ways to communicate. So I think that was a brilliant question. So thank you very much.
If I could perhaps just say that I have no conflict of interest in this, Stefan, but there are some great displays through the way there where people are using music and different things. And if you haven't been able to visit them and talk to them, it's absolutely quite wonderful. And I encourage you to do that with no conflict.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of the session. I want to thank all of you for attending, and to Bill Webster, Sue Morris, and Cindy Casey, thank you so much for your contribution today. It's lunchtime. Please visit everywhere, the art gallery, the exhibits, and so on, and we'll see you this afternoon. Thank you.